When I took the first edition of the Little Loop Railroad on vacation, I brought this Mount Blue Model Co. 23-foot shorty combine with me. And if I'm being honest, I don't really like the car all that much. And to be clear, it's not because I think the kit is bad. Mount Blue makes nicely detailed kits with tons of room for custom paint jobs. And I like the paint job that I put on this car. It's pretty unique. The one thing I don't like about this car is the proportions. The design of the kit is just a little too small for my liking. 3 passenger windows doesn't feel like enough to me, and the car is pretty thin. It's not bad, it's just not what I want. When we started work on the permanent layout for the Little Loop Railroad, in the back of my head I started planning on how I would try to fix this problem. What I eventually came up with was to take the frame off of a Bachmann 26-foot excursion car and use it to scratch build a combine. I have done scratch building before, but usually on a pretty small scale, such as gondola sides or a boxcar roof. This is probably the most ambitious idea I've had. But we're here on YouTube. Challenge just makes things more interesting for a video, right? And more impressive for the train show that I displayed all of this at last week. Well, in mid-November, this idea got a good head start. On Black Friday weekend, I was able to order a trench engine off of Train World that eventually became Peppermint. Thanks to benefactor member Radioisotopics, I was able to order multiple engines for channel projects. We haven't shown off the second one, but we'll be seeing her soon enough. Now, the original plan was just to buy 2 engines, so that's the amount of money that Radio sent me. But, because it was Black Friday weekend, I got a pretty big discount on them. So big, in fact, that I had the money left over to buy an excursion car. Actually, I had the funds for 2 because of how cheap Train World is selling these excursion cars. So, I grabbed 2. One of them was just a generic car that I was planning to scrap for the frame, and the other was one with an H. Lee Riley memorial plaque just to pay some honor to the man who made this scale as popular as it is today. If it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't have gotten invested in On30. With the 2 excursion cars on the way, I started ordering passenger car parts and wood for car walls on the side. And near the end of December, everything arrived. Today, let's build a custom On30 26-foot combine. I started by separating the car body from the shell by applying pressure on the clips for the floor while also trying to pull the body up and off of the frame. Now, I said I wanted to keep the H. Lee Riley as an excursion car, and that's still true. However, the frame it comes with is not as nice as the frame on the generic car, so I swapped them out. With the frame ready, well, I probably should have done this step in a different order, but I decided that instead of assembling the new walls, we needed to paint the windows and doors, for some reason. Basically, all of the detail parts that I ordered for this conversion were from San Juan Details. This is true for the passenger doors, the window frames, the baggage doors, and the interior seats. Before I forget, just so it's noted somewhere in this video, here's the exact list of parts that I ordered from San Juan. I did also order a stove, but I didn't wind up using it. Anyways, for the passenger doors and window frames, I gave them 2 coats of Citadel Color Balor Brown as a nice buff yellow highlight. The first coat often didn't fully cover up the original color, so the second coat really focused on touching up any problem spots on the windows and doors. I then realized I probably should have done the walls first. So, for the walls of the car, I pulled out some 16th-inch scribed wood sheets. At first, I tried cutting them with a Northwest Shortline chopper, but that tool is really designed for cutting pieces that are thinner than its blade, which the scribed wood was very much not. The wood is about 3.5 inches thick, while the blade is probably closer to 1 or 1.5 inches. I very quickly swapped my methods. I instead measured the distance I wanted to cut, used a firm piece of cardboard as a square to get a good right angle, and then used a hobby knife along the cardboard's edge to cut through the wood in multiple strokes. Each cut was 1 3/4 inches, which was about the height of the excursion car. That way, the new car would match the excursion car in height, letting us run a cute 2-car passenger train. Once the height was cut down, I then shortened the length of some of the pieces to better fit the overall shape of the car. The car isn't 3.5 inches wide, nor is it 3.5 inches long, but the wood is. The car body was about 2 inches wide and 5 3/8 inches long. For the car ends, we cut the pieces to fit at about 2 inches long, and for the sides we had one piece the full 3.5 inch length, and another piece cut down to 1 7/8 inches. Before I could glue on the sides though, I needed to add holes for the windows and doors to fit into. This is why I think it was foolish of me to paint them first. We had to wait for the paint to dry before we could test fit them on the wooden walls. Once the paint had dried, though, I cut the San Juan details off of their respective sprues and started figuring out the amount of space each piece was going to take up. The windows were pretty easy to figure out, as each would fit in a 1/2 inch wide hole, but needed at least one board on either side of them to fit properly. Well, 1/2 inch is 1/8, so 8 boards for the hole, plus a 2-board gap between windows to account for that extra space necessary. Figuring out how far down the windows needed to be was a little harder, but not by much. It just required lining up the new wood sides with the old excursion body to test the height. Where the windows were on the excursion car is where the windows should line up with on the new coach. Using another piece of wood as a right angle, I was able to line up all the windows without much issue. Next came the door holes. This was a little annoying to do since both the baggage and passenger doors were almost the same height as the walls, but they weren't quite the same height. This means that the walls we were carving out got so thin at the top or bottom of the doors that they would just naturally break along the seam of the scribed wood boards. Fortunately, we could just glue everything together later, so this wasn't really a problem, but it was annoying. With all the holes for doors and windows in place, I then started supergluing the walls in place on the car frame. I had to both be quick before the glue dried and careful as to line everything up right, but I was able to get it all on the first try with some careful planning. By now, the car was starting to take shape, and this project was starting to look a lot easier than I thought. It was looking a lot more like a busy day's work than a real challenge. I felt pretty confident at this point, and was ready to paint the car properly. For the main walls, I went with Badger Modelflex Light Tuscan Oxide Red. I love dark Tuscan Oxide Red, but I don't really use light very often, and I thought it would be a fun change of pace. To help keep the wooden appearance of the car, I didn't paint everything fully. Some parts I dry brushed to help add a little light inconsistency to try and highlight the material used. Once the walls were mostly red, I would have painted the window frames and doors, but I kinda did that already. So, instead, I got around to gluing them in place with some CA super glue. Something interesting to note here is the baggage doors. First of all, I painted them off camera in Badger Modelflex Dark Tuscan Oxide Red, but more importantly, while the baggage doors came with 4 windows each, I glued them in such a way that only 3 windows were visible. If I hadn't done this, the door would be a little bit too big and it would look like it wouldn't be able to fully open. You might have already noticed the next step in the background footage here. I had some 1/16 of an inch square strip wood lying around that I cut down to the height of the car, the width of the baggage door, and to the length of the passenger compartment to help with the car's trim. The car's height was 1 3/4 inches, the width of the baggage door was 3/4 of an inch, and the length was 3 1/8 inches. Once everything was cut to shape, I painted it all in Ceramcoat brown iron oxide to help highlight the trim, before eventually using wood glue to put the pieces on the cars aside. At this point, I had to take a small detour over to help my father work on the rock faces for the layout. Why does that matter to today's video? Clearance. This coach is the largest non-engine piece of rolling stock that needs to run on the Little Loop Railroad for the show, and the rock face closest to the tracks has some clearance issues with the larger pieces of rolling stock. While other 26-foot cars will make it around without any issue, this one has trouble with the car trim snagging on stuff a little too close to the tracks. The trim is like 1/32 of an inch larger than any other car, and trust me, the clearances are that tight on the Little Loop Railroad. So, to test and make sure everything was okay, we pushed the combine through the problematic area a couple of times just to make sure that everything was smooth. At first, it wasn't smooth, but hey, that's why we have a hammer and chisel. With that detour out of the way, let's get back to the main subject. Next, we cut down a piece of 1/16 of an inch by 1/8 of an inch strip wood to make the letterboard. Like with the trim, we painted it in brown iron oxide and then glued it to the car using wood glue. I specifically cut 2 pieces per side, one for above the passenger windows and one for the front of the car. However, I left a gap in the letterboard where the baggage door was as to not block the baggage door windows. As that was coming together, I kinda realized that I should have painted the end platforms and the car steps much earlier in this project. That way, I wouldn't have to paint around the parts I had already glued down. Not much I can do about that, it's just hindsight at this point. For the coach steps, I painted those in white, and for the end platforms, I painted those in Ceramcoat Territorial Beige to make them look a little wooden. The exterior of the coach was almost done at this point, but the hardest part lay ahead. The roof. A lot of other modelers have shortened down the stock Bachmann 36-foot coaches with some careful cuts and some putty to smooth the gaps. Personally, I've never done anything like this, but now is as good a time as any for me to learn how to, right? After all, I'd like to steal the roof from a stock Bachmann coach and then shorten its length down to match this one. It won't be a full coach shortening project, but it's a good place to start, you know? I have about 20 spare Bachmann coaches, so I grabbed the roof off of one of those and cut it down in 2 spots to shorten the roof by approximately 4 windows worth, or about 11 scale feet. After completing both of the cuts, I did a quick test fit to see how the 2 pieces would look together, and then sanded down the edges to make them nice and smooth. With the joint ready, I got to work adding Tamiya modeling putty to smooth it out. This stuff smelled kind of weird and was a little hard to fit between the joint, but I was able to fit it around the joint enough to get the joint secured pretty easily. Once the putty had a little bit of time to dry, I sanded it down so everything would conform to the shape of the roof. In doing so, however, I sanded away the stuff holding the joint in place more than once, but more putty, especially this time in the joint, helped me to reconnect the pieces. After doing this crazy song and dance a couple of times, and eventually getting everything smooth enough for my liking, we took a quick trip to the paint booth and sprayed the roof and handrails while we were at it in Badger Model Flex Engine Black to get the entire color consistent. As the paint dried, I started work on the car interior. Using some of the leftover pieces of scribed wood from the car walls, I superglued them down to make the interior floor. One of these pieces I cut a door hole into and used it as the separator between the passenger and baggage compartments. I don't know why, but I got sent 4 passenger doors when I only needed 2, so I just used one of the spares here after painting it up. Speaking of painting up, to give the car interior a little more life, I used some Ceramcoat maple wood stain to paint both the walls and floors of the interior. As the wood stain settled, I focused on the seats. I painted the main parts of the seats in Badger Modelflex Southern Sylvan Green, superglued on one armrest per seat without painting them, and then glued in the seats one by one. The right-hand side of the car had 5 seats, 1 per window, but the left-hand side had 4 seats and 1 stove. The stove I wound up using for this was just another stove from a Bachmann coach. We had plenty to spare, after all. Sadly, I didn't have any passengers for the interior, but adding the seats still gave a little bit of extra depth to the car and made it feel more finished. With the roof well dried by now, some blemishes in the putty made themselves apparent. So I went back and sanded things down again a couple of times and hand painted over the re-exposed putty. Once that was done, off camera I tried to do a test fit of the roof, but I very quickly realized that the interior wall and the end walls were too tall, and they had to be trimmed down so that the roof could rest on the car body. At this stage of completion, cutting the walls for this wasn't really easy, but because the roof was blocking the view of most of these parts, the results only needed it to work. They didn't need to look good, and nobody was really gonna see it. With victory on the horizon, I did what I always do. Rush the ending and forget to record these last few little bits. Fortunately, I didn't really do much, as what little I had left to do was just re-adding details like the smoke jack or the roof windows. The only part really worth going into detail about is the pieces of wood that I had to add to help with the roof's alignment. These helped to keep the roof centered on the car and kept it from falling off from sudden motions. It wasn't a tight fit, there was some room to wiggle things around, but generally this held the roof in place. And with that... Well, normally I'd say we're done, but something happened. When getting photos of the final product to share on our supporters-only chat on the Discord server, I put the Combine next to the H. Lee Riley excursion car to assemble a small passenger train for the photo shoot. The two cars, however, looked a little bit out of place next to each other. I actually thought that was kinda cute and quirky, but I also thought it would be nice if all the cars were matching. So, as I sometimes like to do, I went back to the Discord server and asked my supporters what they wanted to see. The vote was tied. I decided to make the cars match. The excursion car was already separated from its frame, so we had a nice head start there when it came to the paint job, but I did need to separate a couple of extra parts. I didn't want to accidentally overpaint onto the passenger benches, so I unscrewed them from the bottom of the car. I also removed the car's roof, which was a little bit harder to do since it was just glued in place. Carefully pulling on it at specific spots and specific patterns, it worked out okay, though. The paint job was basically just the same as it was on the last car. Badger Modelflex light Tuscan oxide red for the sides, making sure to avoid the handrails and memorial plaque. Ceramcoat brown iron oxide for the window trim and letterboard attached to the roof. Citadel color Ballard brown for the posts. Ceramcoat territorial beige for the end platforms. And Badger Modelflex weathered black for the roof touch-ups. I didn't originally plan to paint the roof, but I accidentally got some Tamiya modeling putty on it, so I kinda just had to. With that all done, though, everything was ready to go, and we could reassemble the car by screwing down the seats, snapping on the body, and gluing on the roof again. And with that, we have a very cute two-car shorty passenger train. And some more experience scratch building to go along with it. Honestly, I had so much fun doing this that I may have to try my hand again at something like this in the near future. It wasn't that complicated, and the results are super satisfying to do. Though, I guess that does explain why this combine isn't the only thing I built exclusively for the show. But that's another topic for another time. Thanks for watching. Cheers, folks.